Caught in his royal bedchamber with a working-class stable boy, Grand Duke Ernst Ludwig ignited the royal servant scandal that should have destroyed a dynasty. But he was never punished. This is the factual story of the explosive secret that Queen Victoria tried to bury. Why did the most powerful empire on earth risk its entire reputation to protect a man whose private life threatened its core values? Grand Duke Ernst Ludwig, born in 1868, was the golden child of this fragile web. As the son of Princess Alice and the deeply cherished grandson of Queen Victoria, his pedigree was immaculate. When he ascended to the title of Grand Duke of Hesse, and by Rhine in 1892, he took control of Darmstadt, wielding immense sovereign power and enjoying a level of direct, familiar access to the British royal family that few others possessed. He was, in essence, the blueprint for what would eventually become the Mountbatten dynasty. Ernst was a man of profound contradictions. To the public eye, he was a highly refined, sensitive intellectual. He possessed a keen artistic sensibility, eventually establishing himself as a massive historic patron of the Jugendstil, the German Art Nouveau movement, transforming his capital into a thriving center of culture and modern design. He projected the image of a progressive, thoughtful ruler deeply engaged with the aesthetic elevation of his people. However, behind the heavily guarded velvet-lined doors of the Grand Ducal Palace, a vastly different and highly dangerous reality was unfolding. Ernst Ludwig was a man fundamentally at war with his aristocratic obligations and his own bloodline. While he patronized the fine arts by day, his private desires were raw, untamed, and intensely focused on what the underground subculture of the time referred to as rough trade. Ernst harbored a deep, almost psychological disdain for the perfumed, corseted, highly educated gentlemen of the royal courts. He found no thrill in the polished aristocrats who shared his social standing. Instead, his desires crossed the most dangerous, unspeakable boundary of the Victorian era, the boundary of class. The Grand Duke was entirely captivated by the working-class men who physically sustained his sprawling estate. He sought out the rugged, unpolished soldiers from the local barracks, the exhausted footmen who carried his meals, and, most notoriously, the young, muscular stable boys who worked in the grime and manure of the royal equestrian yards. There was a profound rebellion in his attraction to the sweat, the dirt, and the unrefined masculinity of men who worked with their hands. Ernst utilized his supreme, unquestionable authority not to govern, but to pull these laborers from their stations directly into the royal bedchambers. He systematically turned his ancestral palace into a private, highly volatile playground for his own personal gratification. He used his wealth and his absolute power to ensure silence, creating an environment where the men who cleaned his horses were suddenly elevated to the most intimate, secret spaces of the sovereign's life. This was not just a matter of hidden same-sex scandal. It was a flagrant, reckless abuse of dynastic privilege that placed the entire family's reputation on a knife's edge. Every time a muddy boot stepped onto the royal carpets, late at night, Ernst was gambling with the survival of his throne. The roots of his rebellion trace back to 1878, when a severe diphtheria epidemic claimed the lives of his sister and his mother. Following their deaths, Queen Victoria annexed the Hessian children, dictating their moral development from across the English Channel. Trapped in an endless cycle of mourning, the young prince found himself drawn to the sprawling courtyards below his window. The stable hands and cavalrymen represented a robust physical reality entirely detached from the suffocating grief of his aristocratic existence. But from the windows of his heavily guarded apartment, the young prince could look down into the sprawling courtyards and equestrian yards of the estate. Down there, beyond the velvet curtains and the stifling etiquette, existed an entirely different universe. He watched the stable hands, the grooms, and the soldiers of the Hessian cavalry going about their grueling daily labor. These men were everything the aristocracy was not. They were robust, vital, and physically exhausted by honest, sweating labor. They laughed loudly, they cursed, they wrestled in the dirt, and they lived unburdened by the crushing, morbid expectations of the royal bloodline. They did not wear mourning clothes. They wore rough wool, worn leather, and mud-stained boots. To a boy drowning in the sickly, guilt-ridden atmosphere of the palace, these working-class men represented something intensely alluring. They represented life. As Ernst transitioned from adolescence into young adulthood, this distant fascination mutated into a profound, consuming sexual fixation. The psychological contrast is stark and utterly vital to understanding his later actions. To touch another aristocrat was to touch the very system that had suffocated him, a system associated with fragility, disease, and the watchful judging eye of his grandmother. But to touch a laborer, a man whose hands were calloused, whose body smelled of horse sweat and cheap tobacco, was an act of pure, visceral rebellion. It was a grounding mechanism. The rough trade subculture offered him a temporary escape from his own identity. In the arms of a stable boy, he was no longer the grieving prince who had caused his mother's death, nor was he the heavily scrutinized heir to the Grand Duchy. The transaction was stark, physical, and devoid of aristocratic pretense. It was an arena where his wealth and power could buy him momentary, uncomplicated submission from men who possessed the raw physical vitality he so desperately craved. With this new, supreme authority, Ernst began to carefully but systematically cultivate his secret life. He navigated the rigid, hyper-masculine culture of the German Empire, where military service was the ultimate expression of national pride. The barracks and the royal stables became his private hunting grounds. The mechanics of his indiscretions were a masterclass in the abuse of absolute power. A subtle gesture to a loyal adjutant, a quiet word passed down the chain of command, and a specifically chosen young soldier or groom would be relieved of his regular duties. Under the guise of a special detail or an unrecorded night watch, these men were quietly ushered through the servants' corridors, bypassing the official guards, and brought directly into the Grand Duke's private chambers. It was a deeply unequal exchange driven by a massive power disparity. The laborers knew exactly who they were dealing with. To refuse the sovereign was to risk their employment, their military standing, and their livelihoods. To comply was to secure unexpected financial rewards, leniency in their duties, and the bizarre, terrifying protection of the crown. The psychological dynamic within that bedchamber was a profound inversion of the natural social order. The absolute ruler of the land, the man who wore the glittering decorations of European empires, willingly stripped himself of his dignity to submit to the physical dominance of the lowest-ranking men in his employ. It was a theater of degradation that Ernst actively orchestrated and fiercely craved. He reveled in the dirt they tracked onto his carpets, finding a perverse grounding comfort in the very coarseness that the rest of his family found repulsive. While he built this dangerous underground world under the cover of darkness, Ernst simultaneously cultivated a magnificent public persona. He was determined to offset his secret sins with highly visible, culturally significant virtues. He poured the duchy's wealth into the arts, founding the famous Darmstadt Artists Colony at Mathildenhöhe. He sponsored architects, painters, and sculptors, aggressively pushing his capital to the forefront of the European Art Nouveau movement. He was charming, erudite, and wildly popular with the artists he championed. He walked through the sunlit galleries of his city as an enlightened, progressive monarch, entirely unrecognizable from the man who prowled the shadows of the stables at midnight. This intense duality became the defining rhythm of his life, a continuous, exhausting performance designed to distract the world from the truth. But the architecture of his double life was inherently unstable. He was operating in an era where the press was becoming increasingly aggressive, and the political atmosphere in Germany was growing highly suspicious of aristocratic decadence. More importantly, he had overlooked the one force that he could never truly control: the relentless dynastic ambition of Queen Victoria. As Ernst settled into his reign, enjoying the absolute freedom of his dual existence, the matriarch in London was growing increasingly impatient. A sovereign Grand Duke in his mid-20s, holding a vital strategic position in Europe, could not remain a bachelor. He needed a wife to solidify the alliance, and he needed heirs to secure the bloodline. Queen Victoria did not care about his artistic colonies, and she certainly did not care about his personal happiness. She viewed her grandson merely as a piece on a grand geopolitical chessboard. She began to mobilize her diplomatic channels, sifting through the eligible princesses of Europe, entirely unaware that the man she was attempting to marry off was deeply embedded in a lifestyle that made a traditional marriage biologically and psychologically impossible for him. The trap was slowly being set. Ernst had spent his entire adult life building a secret sanctuary of rough trade and illicit freedom, but the crushing, inescapable machinery of royal duty was about to bear down upon him. He was about to be forced into a collision course with a woman who had the fire, the intelligence, and the royal backing to tear his carefully constructed world apart. The stage was set for a disaster of unprecedented proportions, a union forged not in love, but in a lethal combination of dynastic blindness and desperate, hidden vice. The tragedy of the human experience often lies in our desperate attempts to outrun our deepest traumas, only to inadvertently build a new prison out of our coping mechanisms. Ernst Ludwig had sought the warmth, vitality, and uncomplicated dirt of the stables to escape the cold, suffocating grief of his royal inheritance. He believed his absolute power could protect his transgressions, that he could endlessly manipulate the machinery of his court to serve his underground desires while maintaining the illusion of majesty. But power is a fragile shield against the relentless demands of a bloodline. He had created a deeply fractured existence, standing on the precipice of a forced marriage that would demand the one thing he was completely incapable of giving: authenticity. The storm was no longer gathering in the distance. It was marching directly toward the doors of his palace, carrying the terrifying weight of the British Empire with it. The trap closed around Grand Duke Ernst Ludwig, not with a sudden snap, but with the slow, agonizing, and entirely unstoppable grind of royal diplomatic gears. Queen Victoria did not ask, she decreed. Sitting at her desk in Windsor Castle, thousands of miles away from the grim realities of the Hessian equestrian yards, the aging matriarch studied the map of Europe. She saw bloodlines, alliances, and buffer states. She did not see human beings. In her relentless pursuit of dynastic consolidation, she locked her sights on the perfect bride to anchor her favored grandson to the British sphere of influence. Her choice was Princess Victoria Melita of Edinburgh, Ernst's own first cousin. It was a decision that demonstrated the terrifying elf-fuel blindness of the royal system, a system perfectly capable of engineering a spectacular public triumph while setting the stage for a private, catastrophic slaughter. Princess Victoria Melita, known as Ducky to her family, was perhaps the absolute worst possible match for a man secretly consumed by a hatred of his own class and a physical revulsion toward aristocratic women. She was not a docile, submissive pawn willing to fade quietly into the tapestries of a German palace. She was a deeply complex, highly volatile combination of British imperial pride and fiery Romanov blood. Her mother was Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna of Russia, daughter of the Tsar. Her father was Prince Alfred, the Duke of Edinburgh and Queen Victoria's second son. From the Romanovs, Ducky inherited a towering sense of entitlement, a brooding intensity, and a demand for absolute, all-consuming passion. She was tall, striking, fiercely intelligent, and possessed an artistic, tempestuous nature that craved engagement and physical affection. She was a woman who demanded to be seen, to be desired, and to be worshipped. To throw this vibrant, demanding young woman into the path of Ernst Ludwig was to throw a lit match into a powder keg. Ernst was entirely unequipped to handle her. He was accustomed to the silent, transactional, and intensely physical encounters with men who were socially beneath him, men who asked no questions and demanded no emotional reciprocity. The prospect of sharing a bed, let alone a life, with a highly educated, fiercely opinionated, and intensely romantic aristocratic woman paralyzed him. But defiance was not an option. The psychological hold Queen Victoria had over him, forged in the trauma of his mother's death, was absolute. The pressure mounted from all sides. Diplomats drafted the marriage contracts. The press began to sing the praises of the impending union. Ernst found himself trapped in a gilded corridor with no exits, marching steadily toward an altar he viewed as an execution block. The wedding took place in April 1894 in the town of Coburg. It was not merely a marriage. It was one of the greatest, most glittering summits of European royalty in the 19th century. Every major royal house converged on the small German duchy. The streets were lined with cavalry, draped in bunting, and packed with cheering crowds who believed they were witnessing the ultimate fairy tale. Queen Victoria herself made the arduous journey from England to personally oversee her grand design. The Kaiser of Germany was there. The future Tsar Nicholas II of Russia was there, using the occasion to secretly betroth himself to Ernst's sister, Alex. The air was thick with political maneuvering, champagne, and the overwhelming scent of hothouse flowers. Yet, at the very center of this staggering display of wealth and global power stood a bride and groom who were entirely isolated from the joy surrounding them. As Ernst stood in his pristine military uniform, weighed down by medals and the crushing expectations of an empire, he was committing an act of profound betrayal. He was swearing an oath before God and his sovereign to love, honor, and cherish a woman he could barely stand to touch. The grandeur of the Coburg wedding was nothing more than an immensely expensive, highly orchestrated lie. It was a lavender marriage engineered by a grandmother who refused to see the truth, forced upon a grandson too terrified to speak it, and inflicted upon a bride entirely unaware of the invisible, insurmountable wall standing between her and her new husband. The brutal reality of their union did not take years to surface. It manifested almost the moment the heavy doors of the bridal suite closed. The honeymoon period, a time culturally mandated for physical intimacy and emotional bonding, became an immediate agonizing battleground of silence and rejection. Ducky, fueled by the romantic literature of the era and her own passionate nature, expected a devoted, ardent lover. She expected the grand romance that had been promised to her by the royal establishment. Instead, she found herself walled inside a fortress of sudden, inexplicable indifference. Ernst was completely paralyzed by his new role. He could play the enlightened Grand Duke in the public squares, but in the intimate, suffocating space of the bedchamber, his performative abilities entirely collapsed. He avoided her. He fabricated excuses regarding state duties, administrative burdens, and minor illnesses. He spent hours locked in his study, buried in architectural plans and art catalogs, leaving his vibrant young wife isolated in an enormous echoing palace. When proximity was unavoidable, his physical recoil was unmistakable. A brush of the hand, a lean in for a kiss, these gestures were met with a stiffening of his spine and a polite, chilling withdrawal. Ducky was deeply humiliated. At first, she turned the blame inward, as many women of her era were conditioned to do. She questioned her own attractiveness, her manners, her ability to please. She tried to mold herself into whatever she thought he wanted, suppressing her Romanov fire and adopting a quieter, more submissive demeanor. It made absolutely no difference. The absolute lack of physical desire in her husband's eyes was not a reflection of her inadequacies. It was a symptom of an entirely different hidden reality she could not yet comprehend. As the months dragged on, the coldness calcified into a bitter, daily reality. The palace in Darmstadt, which Ernst had so painstakingly decorated with cutting-edge Art Nouveau designs, became a beautifully gilded prison. But Ernst could not sustain the isolation forever. The psychological pressure of maintaining the facade of a dutiful husband during the day drove his nocturnal urges into overdrive. The proximity of a wife he resented deeply accelerated his need for the grounding, rough reality of his underground life. He needed the dirt. He needed the stark and complicated submission of the working class. Slowly, recklessly, he began to reopen the secret channels of the palace. The subtle mechanics of his dual life ground back into motion. The trusted adjutants were quietly instructed. The schedules of the night watchmen were altered. The side doors leading to the servants' quarters and the lower courtyards were left unlocked. Ernst began to retreat from his wife's apartments earlier and earlier in the evening, claiming exhaustion, only to disappear into the vast, shadowy corridors of the estate. While Princess Victoria Melita lay awake in a silk-draped bed, listening to the agonizing silence of the Hessian night, her husband was actively pulling the raw, unwashed reality of the stables directly into the adjacent rooms. He became incredibly brazen, his caution entirely eroded by the arrogant belief that his sovereign status made him untouchable. He no longer confined his liaisons to the distant, hidden corners of the estate. He began bringing soldiers and grooms directly into the private royal apartments. The contrast was a daily, violent assault on the senses. The heavy, muddy boots of cavalrymen left distinct tracks on the pristine woven carpets of the grand ducal corridors. The faint, undeniable odor of cheap tobacco, horse sweat, and unwashed wool began to linger in the velvet-lined hallways, entirely out of place in the sterile, perfumed environment of the aristocracy. Victoria Melita was not a fool. She possessed a sharp investigative mind, and she began to notice the inconsistencies. She noticed the nervous, averted gazes of the household staff when she walked past. She noticed the sudden, unexplained promotions of entirely unqualified, unusually handsome young footmen who suddenly possessed an arrogant swagger entirely unbecoming of their station. She noticed the way her husband would come to breakfast looking entirely exhausted, his eyes bloodshot, carrying a scent that was definitely not the refined cologne of a German sovereign. The puzzle pieces were scattered all around her, jagged and ugly. The psychological warfare within the marriage escalated from passive neglect to active hostile territory. Ernst, deeply defensive and terrified of exposure, began to gaslight his wife. When she questioned his absences, he accused her of being hysterical, demanding and utterly unsuited for the stoic duties of a German ruler's wife. He weaponized her emotional volatility against her, painting her as a dramatic, unstable woman to the royal court, effectively isolating her further. He surrounded himself with a tight inner circle of loyal, complicit courtiers who aided in his deceptions, creating a wall of silence that Ducky could not penetrate. She was a foreign princess trapped in an alien court, legally bound to a man who despised her very presence, and entirely surrounded by people paid to protect his secrets at her expense. But the sheer volume of his indiscretions made the truth impossible to contain indefinitely. The whispers could no longer be confined to the servants' quarters. They began to bleed into the aristocratic drawing rooms of Darmstadt, carried by disgruntled ex-employees and sharp-eyed courtiers. The rumors were vicious, explicit, and highly dangerous. They spoke of a Grand Duke who preferred the company of the barracks to the company of his bride. They spoke of midnight trysts and rough, degrading encounters. Ducky, isolated but fiercely proud, began to intercept these whispers. The crushing realization did not arrive as a single sudden blow, but as a slow, agonizing poisoning of her reality. She was not just dealing with an unfaithful husband. She was dealing with a systemic institutional betrayal. She began to realize that the entire marriage was a hollow protective shell constructed solely to house his deviance. Her youth, her capacity for love, and her entire future had been casually sacrificed on the altar of his reputation. The resentment that had been building inside her began to mutate into something far more dangerous. It mutated into a cold, hard, and absolute fury. She was a Romanov and a Windsor. She was not raised to be a silent, long-suffering victim in a dark German palace. She decided to stop asking questions and start hunting for the answers herself. She began to track his movements, quietly noting the changing of the guards, the locked doors, and the irregular hours. She was no longer a naive bride waiting for affection. She was a predator stalking the truth through the shadowy corridors of her own home, moving closer and closer to the explosive, irrevocable collision that would tear the facade of the Hessian court to absolute shreds. The midnight silence of the Grand Ducal Palace was a tense, vibrating stillness, the kind that exists just before a catastrophic structural collapse. For weeks, Princess Victoria Melita had existed within this agonizing vacuum, lying awake in her sprawling, silk-draped bedchamber, her senses hyper-tuned to the faint, betraying rhythms of the estate. She had memorized the creak of the floorboards in the adjacent corridors, the muffled click of heavy iron locks turning, and the precise, hurried footsteps that did not belong to the aristocratic members of the household. The palace was a living, breathing machine of deception, and Ducky had finally figured out how to dismantle it. She was done being the compliant, weeping victim of a German sovereign's indifference. The Romanov blood in her veins, famous for its fiery, unyielding pride, demanded retribution. On the night the facade finally shattered, the air in Darmstadt was thick and oppressive. Ernst had retired early, offering his wife a stiff, practiced bow and a hollow excuse about a migraine and the heavy burdens of state administration. He retreated into his private wing, a heavily fortified sanctuary where even the most senior courtiers were forbidden to enter without explicit summons. But Ducky did not go to sleep, shy. He waited in the dark, her heart hammering a relentless rhythm against her ribs, listening as the palace settled into its nocturnal routine. Hours passed, and then she heard it, the unmistakable heavy tread of boots moving through the servants' passageway, bypassing the formal guards, and heading directly toward the Grand Duke's private apartments. She rose from her bed. She did not bother to ring for her ladies-in-waiting or throw on a heavy formal dressing gown. Clad only in her light night clothes, her hair cascading wildly over her shoulders, she moved out into the corridor. The contrast was stark. A vulnerable, solitary woman navigating the cold, imposing, hyper-masculine architecture of the Hessian military state. Yet there was no vulnerability in her eyes. There was only a cold, predatory focus. She moved swiftly past the oil lamps that cast long, distorted shadows against the velvet wallpaper, her bare feet making no sound on the thick carpets. When she reached the imposing carved oak doors of Ernst's private suite, she found the two loyal guards standing at attention. They stiffened, their eyes widening in sheer panic at the sight of the Grand Duchess. Protocol dictated they stop anyone from entering, but they were soldiers of the duchy, and she was their sovereign's wife. To lay a hand on her was treason. To let her pass was to invite catastrophe. Paralyzed by the impossible hierarchy of their duties, they stepped aside, their silence sealing their master's fate. Ducky did not knock. She did not ask for permission. With a violent, explosive force fueled by months of humiliation and suppressed rage, she gripped the heavy brass handles and threw the double doors wide open. They crashed against the inner walls with a sound like a gunshot, shattering the illicit sanctity of the room. The scene that greeted her was burned into her retinas instantly, a tableau of absolute, undeniable degradation that defied every law of God, nature, and empire she had ever been, and taught to revere. The bedchamber, a masterpiece of opulent Art Nouveau design, was bathed in the warm, flickering light of the fireplace. But there was nothing beautiful about what was happening within it. Tangled in the pristine monogrammed linen sheets of the Grand Ducal bed was her husband, the sovereign ruler of Hesse, in a compromising state, his body slick with sweat. And locked in a frantic, desperate embrace with him was not a courtesan, not an aristocratic lover, but a young, dirt-smudged stable boy. The visual shock of the contrast was physically nauseating. The boy could not have been more than 20. His skin was rough, tanned by the sun, and stained with the unmistakable grime of the equestrian yards. His hands, gripping the shoulders of the Grand Duke, were calloused and black with grease and soil. The faint, sharp stench of horse manure, cheap tobacco, and unwashed sweat hung in the perfumed air of the royal suite. Ernst, the man who refused to hold his wife's hand in public because it violated his delicate sensibilities, was willingly, eagerly submitting to the coarse, reckless, physical struggle of a peasant laborer. For a fraction of a second, time entirely stopped. The three of them were frozen in a horrific living painting. The stable boy's eyes widened in sheer mortal terror. He knew instantly that his neck was on the line. To be caught in the sovereign's bed by the Grand Duchess was a crime that could easily end in a quiet execution or a lifelong disappearance into a military prison. He scrambled backward, ripping himself away from Ernst, clawing desperately at the sheets to cover his nakedness, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. Ernst's reaction was not one of apologies or desperate pleading. It was a pathetic, frantic attempt to reclaim his shattered authority while entirely stripped of his dignity. He scrambled against the headboard, pulling the blankets up to his chest, his face pale and contorted with a mixture of profound chasse, hawk and rising defensive anger. He opened his mouth to speak, to order her out, to command the obedience he was accustomed to, but he never got the chance. The dam of Ducky's restraint broke, unleashing a torrent of absolute destructive fury. She did not collapse into tears or swoon like a fragile Victorian heroine. She turned into a hurricane. Her eyes locking onto her husband's terrified face, she let out a scream that tore through the heavy velvet drapes and echoed down the stone corridors of the palace. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated betrayal. She lunged forward, grabbing the nearest object, a heavy, ornate porcelain vase resting on a bedside table, and hurled it violently across the room. It smashed into 1,000 jagged pieces against the wall just inches from Ernst's head, showering the bed in sharp fragments. She slammed the heavy oak door shut behind her, the sound echoing with finality. Ducky did not return to her bed. She stormed into her own apartment, startling her sleeping ladies-in-waiting, and began issuing rapid, chaotic orders. Trunks were to be brought up immediately. Clothes were to be packed. Carriages were to be readied for the first train out of Darmstadt. As her terrified staff rushed around her, packing her jewels and silk gowns in a frantic blur, Ducky sat at her writing desk. Her hand shook so violently she could barely hold the pen, but she forced herself to write. She wrote frantic, explosive letters to her family, detailing the sheer horror of her reality. She penned the words that would later become infamous in royal circles, declaring with absolute certainty that the depravity in Darmstadt was so profound that no young boy in the entire palace was safe from the Grand Duke's predatory reach, from the lowliest kitchen scullion to the grooms in the stables. By dawn, Princess Victoria Melita was gone. She fled the suffocating borders of the German Empire, taking the train across the continent, watching the landscape blur through the window as her mind raced. She was armed with the most dangerous weapon in the world, the undeniable eyewitness truth. She possessed the power to entirely dismantle a reigning monarch. She believed, with the naive certainty of a wronged woman, that the truth would set her free. She believed that when she presented the horrifying facts of Ernst's illegal and degenerate behavior to the ultimate authority, she would be granted an immediate divorce, an apology, and her freedom. Her destination was England. Her target was the absolute pinnacle of global power, her grandmother, Queen Victoria. When Ducky arrived at Windsor Castle, she was exhausted, emotionally raw, and burning with righteous indignation. She demanded an immediate audience with the Queen. She was ushered into the heavy, suffocatingly dark drawing rooms where the matriarch of the British Empire spent her days entirely clad in black mourning clothes. Queen Victoria sat in her armchair, small, ancient, yet emanating an aura of absolute, terrifying authority. The Queen looked at her granddaughter, noting the pale skin, the dark circles under her eyes, and the frantic energy radiating from her. Ducky did not hold back. She fell to her knees before the Queen and unleashed the entire devastating truth. She spared no details. She described the coldness, the neglect, the whispers. And then she described the bedroom door. She described the stable boy. She described the dirt, the smell, the absolute undeniable proof of Ernst's same-sex scandal and his illegal predatory obsession with the working class. She laid the explosive reality of the Hessian court squarely at the feet of the woman who had engineered it. Historical accounts suggest the confrontation was violent and explosive. Driven by months of humiliation, Victoria Melita reportedly shattered objects across the room, verbally devastating the Grand Duke and his illicit lover. Stripped of his sovereign authority in his own bedroom, Ernst could offer no defense against his wife's absolute fury. Vowing to expose his secret to the royal courts of Europe, Ducky fled the palace before dawn, seeking justice from the ultimate authority, Queen Victoria. However, when Ducky presented the undeniable truth to the matriarch of the British Empire, pleading for a dissolution of the marriage, the response was calculating and absolute. Prioritizing the survival of the institution over her granddaughter's trauma, the Queen strictly forbade the divorce. She decreed that Ducky must return to Darmstadt and maintain the facade, utilizing the immense social and financial weight of the crown to threaten the young princess with total exile and ruin if she dared to expose the Grand Duke's crimes. The threat was absolute. It was a death sentence to her social and financial survival. Ducky was trapped. She had brought a desperate plea for justice to the ultimate authority, only to discover that the authority was the very architect of the cover-up. Defeated, drained of all adrenaline, and broken by the profound hypocrisy of the woman she had trusted, the princess collapsed inward. She nodded slowly, the fight entirely extinguished from her eyes. Within hours of that chilling confrontation, the vast, invisible, and terrifying machinery of the British and German royal cover-up roared into motion. Queen Victoria did not leave things to chance. She deployed her most trusted diplomats and private secretaries, utilizing a shadow network designed specifically to clean up the messes of the elite. The operation was swift, silent, and incredibly brutal in its efficiency. The first target was the stable boy. He was the most dangerous loose end, a working-class youth holding a secret that could topple a throne. He was quietly intercepted by the Grand Ducal police before he could ever reach a tavern to boast or complain. He was not killed, but his life as he knew it was erased. He was offered a terrifying choice: accept a massive, life-altering sum of money and immediate relocation to a distant, grueling military outpost in the far reaches of the German colonies, or face a sudden fatal accident in the equestrian yards. The boy took the money and vanished into the colonial machinery, his name scrubbed from the palace employment records as if he had never existed. Next came the palace staff, the guards who had stepped aside for the princess, the chambermaids who washed the soiled sheets, the adjutants who managed the Duke's midnight schedules. All were systematically interrogated by the head of the Hessian secret police. They were reminded of the absolute unforgiving nature of the treason laws. Threats were issued, pensions were leveraged, and a wall of absolute silence was erected around the events of that night. Anyone who whispered a single word regarding the Grand Duke's private habits would find themselves destitute and imprisoned. Simultaneously, the Queen's agents intercepted the frantic letters Ducky had written to her family on the night of her flight. The correspondence, filled with explosive, detailed descriptions of Ernst's depravity, was confiscated before it could reach the hands of anyone outside the absolute inner circle. The letters were burned in the fireplaces of Windsor and Buckingham Palace, turning the only physical evidence of the sovereign's crimes into literal ash. The press, entirely reliant on the goodwill of the royal courts for access and information, was fed a sterile, highly curated narrative. The Grand Duchess had simply visited her grandmother in England to seek advice on minor marital disagreements, and all was perfectly well in the House of Hesse. 2 weeks later, Princess Victoria Melita boarded a train back to Germany. The journey was a slow, agonizing funeral march for her spirit. When she arrived at the station in Darmstadt, she was greeted by the military band playing cheerful marches and the local aristocracy waving flags. It was a grotesque pantomime of loyalty and happiness. She stepped off the train, her face pale and rigid, and walked back into the very prison she had so desperately tried to escape. When she finally crossed the threshold of the Grand Ducal Palace, Ernst Ludwig was waiting for her in the main foyer. He was dressed immaculately in his military uniform, playing the role of the devoted, relieved husband for the benefit of the watching courtiers. But as he stepped forward to kiss her hand, Ducky saw the look in his eyes. It was not guilt, it was not remorse, it was a chilling, quiet arrogance. Ernst had realized the full extent of his victory. The crisis that should have destroyed him had instead rendered him utterly invincible. He had been caught in the most degrading, indefensible position imaginable, and yet the most powerful monarch in the world had stepped in to protect him. Queen Victoria had not punished him, she had punished his wife. The system had effectively told him that his power was absolute, that his bloodline shielded him from all earthly consequences, and that his wife was nothing more than a hostage provided by the state to maintain his cover. The dynamic between them shifted from passive neglect to a toxic, highly controlled warfare. They were shackled together by the Queen's iron decree, forced to eat at the same table, attend the same operas, and smile for the same cameras, all while harboring a mutual, violently intense hatred for one another. Ernst, emboldened by his grandmother's protection, did not abandon his hidden life. He merely refined its architecture. He was smarter now. He no longer brought the rough trade into the royal bedchamber where his wife could easily intercept them. Instead, he utilized hunting lodges on the far edges of his estates, private apartments in other cities under assumed names, and highly secretive, deeply vetted circles of complicit soldiers. He continued to gorge himself on the raw, unpolished masculinity of the lower classes, leaving Ducky entirely isolated in the massive, echoing palace. She lived a ghostly existence, trapped in a state of perpetual vigilance and deep, unspoken trauma. She knew exactly what her husband was doing. She knew the exact scent of the men he pursued, and she knew with terrifying clarity that she was completely powerless to stop it. She was a warden forced to guard her own jailer. The psychological toll on Ducky was devastating. She began to exhibit signs of severe depression, her natural vibrancy hardening into a sharp, brittle cynicism. To the outside world, the Hessian court appeared to be a beacon of Art Nouveau elegance and cultural sophistication, heavily sponsored by the generous Grand Duke. But behind the velvet ropes, it was a mausoleum of human spirit. The aristocrats who visited noted the freezing tension between the couple, the way they avoided eye contact, the way the air seemed to turn to ice when they were forced to stand next to one another at state functions, but nobody dared to question it. The Queen had decreed that the marriage was a success, and therefore reality had to bend to accommodate the decree. The ultimate, most tragic chain in this meticulously designed prison was yet to be forged. The royal establishment, deeply unsatisfied with simply keeping the couple together, demanded the ultimate proof of a functional marriage, an heir. The pressure placed upon them from London and Berlin was immense and relentless. A childless royal marriage was a political liability, a constant generator of rumors and instability. To survive the intense scrutiny of the courts, they had to perform the most intimate act of all, an act that deeply repulsed them both. The conception of their first child was not an act of love or even of momentary passion. It was a grim mechanical execution of dynastic duty, negotiated and performed with the cold precision of a military maneuver. When Ducky gave birth to Princess Elizabeth in 1895, the court rejoiced. The cannons fired, the church bells rang, and the press celebrated the happy union. But for Ducky, the arrival of her daughter was the final heavy lock clicking into place on her cage. She loved her child fiercely, desperately, but she knew that Elizabeth's existence meant she could never truly run away again. The child bound her permanently to the House of Hesse, to the husband who despised her, and to the horrifying secrets she was forced to swallow every single day. Grand Duke Ernst Ludwig looked upon his newborn daughter not as a miracle, but as the ultimate shield. With a legitimate heir in the nursery, his cover was absolutely perfect. He could now walk through the streets of Darmstadt, playing the role of the doting father and the respectable patriarch, while simultaneously managing his underground network of illicit liaisons with absolute impunity. The royal machinery had worked flawlessly. The dirt of the stables had been successfully swept under the heavy gold-embroidered rugs of the empire, and the victims had been violently silenced. But the human spirit, especially one forged in the fires of the Romanov dynasty, cannot be compressed indefinitely without a reaction. The cover-up had bought the Grand Duke time, but it had not bought him peace. Ducky was trapped, but she was not dead. She was simply biding her time, waiting in the shadows of the Hessian court for the inevitable moment when the ancient, terrifying power of Queen Victoria would finally expire, taking the entire architecture of the cover-up with it into the grave. The arrival of Princess Elizabeth in 1895 introduced a profound, agonizing complication into the toxic warfare of the Hessian court. In the simplistic narratives of royal history, the birth of a child is often portrayed as a healing mechanism, a bridge over troubled waters that miraculously unites a fractured couple. The reality in Darmstadt was far darker and entirely more complex. The child did not unite Ernst and Victoria Melita. Rather, she became a shared, heavily guarded territory in a palace that had otherwise been entirely partitioned by hatred. To Ducky, the little girl was her sole anchor to sanity, the only genuine, untainted source of love in a world built on lies. But the most shocking development, the one that deeply unsettled the princess and complicated her clear-cut narrative of victimhood, was Ernst's reaction to the child. The man who possessed a predatory criminal obsession with the rough trade of the stables, the man who treated his wife with a coldness that bordered on psychological torture, turned out to be an intensely devoted, fiercely loving father. When he looked at Princess Elizabeth, the arrogant, defensive posture of the Grand Duke vanished. He spent hours in the nursery, entirely unconcerned with aristocratic protocol, crawling on the floor, playing games and doting on the little girl with a warmth he had never once shown to his wife. He designed elaborate toys for her, commissioned portraits, and allowed her to interrupt his most serious state meetings. For Ducky, watching this was a specific kind of psychological torment. She was forced to witness her husband exhibit the exact capacity for tenderness, devotion, and pure love that he had actively, maliciously withheld from her. It made his rejection of her all the more personal and devastating. He was not incapable of love. He simply found her utterly unlovable. This contradiction became the defining rhythm of their public and private lives as the 19th century ground toward its conclusion. They existed in a bizarre high-stakes equilibrium. During the daylight hours, they performed the roles of the enlightened European sovereigns. Ernst poured the vast wealth of his duchy into the creation of the Mathildenhöhe, the famous artists' colony in Darmstadt. He invited the greatest architects, sculptors, and painters of the Jugendstil movement to build a utopian vision of modern living on the hills overlooking his capital. He was universally praised as a visionary, a man of immense culture and refined intellect. He walked through the sunlit galleries, shaking hands with bohemian artists, discussing the elevation of the human spirit through design. Yet the moment the sun set and the formal dinners concluded, the grand illusion fractured. Ernst would retreat to his private lodges or utilize his heavily vetted silent network of adjutants to summon the soldiers and grooms he still desperately craved. The architecture of his deviance had simply become more sophisticated. He no longer risked the explosive confrontations of the royal bedchamber. He compartmentalized his existence with terrifying efficiency. The enlightened patron of the arts by day, the devoted father in the afternoon, and the relentless predator of the working class by night. He had learned how to perfectly balance the crushing demands of his bloodline with the raw, illicit hungers of his own nature, and he did it all under the absolute invisible protection of Queen Victoria's terrifying decree. For Princess Victoria Melita, the final years of the 19th century were an exercise in suffocating endurance. She was entirely trapped in a state of suspended animation. She could not leave, she could not speak the truth, and she could not forge a meaningful life within the borders of Hesse. She became a cynic, a woman whose natural Romanov fire had been systematically smothered by the wet blanket of British imperial pragmatism. She watched her husband receive accolades and adoration from the public, knowing with absolute certainty that the man they were cheering for was a carefully constructed fiction. She developed a hardened, bitter exterior, isolating herself from the courtiers she knew were complicit in Ernst's secret life. She poured all her thwarted passion into horses, riding recklessly through the Hessian countryside, seeking the only physical freedom she was allowed. They were waiting. The entire court, the diplomats, the spies, and the trappe, die Princess, they were all holding their collective breath, participating in a grand, morbid, waiting game. They were waiting for the inevitable biological failure of the woman sitting on the throne in Windsor Castle. They all knew, though no one dared to speak it aloud, that the marriage of the Grand Duke and Duchess was entirely propped up by the sheer terrifying willpower of one ancient woman. The fracture point finally arrived in the bitter cold of January 1901. The news did not come as a sudden shock, but as a slow, momentous rumble that shook the foundations of the global geopolitical order. Queen Victoria, the grandmother of Europe, the architect of 1,000 alliances, and the absolute warden of the Hessian prison, was dead. The reaction across the world was one of profound mourning and destabilizing uncertainty. An entire era had ended. But inside the private apartments of Princess Victoria Melita in Darmstadt, the death of the matriarch did not register as a tragedy. It registered as the loud, unmistakable sound of a heavy iron padlock finally snapping open. The absolute authority that had threatened her with ruin, exile, and social annihilation was suddenly gone. The new King of England, Edward VII, was Ducky's uncle, a man known for his own highly publicized moral failings and his deep sympathy for the human weaknesses of his relatives. He did not possess his mother's iron-fisted obsession with maintaining the facade at all costs. The suffocating, terrifying threat of complete destruction was lifted. Ducky did not hesitate. The grief of the public had not even begun to subside. The black mourning crepe was still being draped over the monuments of Europe when she launched her offensive. She had spent 7 years stockpiling her anger, refining her legal arguments, and preparing for this exact moment. She immediately moved out of the Grand Ducal Palace, physically separating herself from Ernst, and initiated the formal explosive process of seeking a divorce. Ernst Ludwig was caught entirely off guard. He had grown so accustomed to the absolute protection of his grandmother that he had fundamentally underestimated his wife's capacity for vengeance. He believed that the passage of time, the birth of their daughter, and the sheer weight of public expectation had permanently broken her will to fight. He scrambled to contain the situation, deploying his lawyers and appealing to the various royal houses of Europe to intervene and stop the scandal. But the ground had shifted entirely beneath his feet. The German Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was deeply homophobic and intensely protective of the moral image of his military state, was horrified by the rumors that suddenly flooded his desk. The Russian court, led by Ducky's sister-in-law, Tsarina Alexandra, attempted to mediate, but Ducky refused to back down. She made it absolutely clear, if Ernst contested the divorce, if he attempted to keep her trapped for a single day longer, she would unleash the full, unvarnished truth in open court. She would testify under oath about the stable boy. She would name the soldiers. She would burn the House of Hesse to the ground. Faced with the terrifying prospect of total public ruin and criminal prosecution, Ernst Ludwig capitulated. He realized that the only way to save his throne and keep his devastating secrets out of the international press was to give his wife exactly what she demanded. The negotiations were bitter, ruthless, and entirely focused on damage control. The royal lawyers worked frantically to construct a legal narrative that would satisfy the courts without exposing the criminal reality of the Grand Duke's private life. On December 21, 1901, the Supreme Court of Hesse officially dissolved the marriage of Grand Duke Ernst Ludwig and Princess Victoria Melita. The official reason cited in the court documents was invincible mutual antipathy. It was a brilliant, sterile legal fiction. It suggested a simple clash of personalities, a tragic incompatibility of two highly strung aristocrats. It completely erased the dirt, the exploitation, the midnight betrayals, and the profound institutional abuse of power that had actually destroyed the Union. The press accepted the official narrative, publishing somber articles about the unfortunate failure of the royal alliance, completely blind to the explosive truth buried just beneath the surface. Ducky packed her belongings and left Darmstadt for the final time. She walked away from her title, her position, and the palace that had served as her torture chamber for nearly a decade. She was deeply scarred, her reputation damaged by the stigma of being a divorced woman in a rigid society. But she was finally free. She had survived the absolute worst the royal establishment could inflict upon her. But her victory was agonizingly incomplete. As part of the ruthless divorce settlement engineered by the Hessian lawyers, Ducky was forced to surrender primary custody of the one thing she truly loved. Princess Elizabeth, the heir to the duchy, was to remain in Darmstadt with her father, with Ducky only granted supervised visits for a few months out of the year. It was a final brutal twist of the knife. Ernst Ludwig had lost his wife, but he had kept his throne, his secrets, and his beloved daughter. He watched Ducky's carriage roll out of the palace gates, effectively erasing her from his daily reality. The immediate crisis was over. He had survived the collapse of his forced marriage and the death of his greatest protector. He retreated back into the sprawling, heavily fortified walls of his estate, returning to the shadows, entirely convinced that the worst of the storm had passed. But the tragic, inescapable reality of the royal bloodline is that the bill always comes due, and the absolute worst devastation was yet to strike. The immediate aftermath of the historic 1901 divorce settled over the Grand Ducal Palace in Darmstadt, not as a storm, but as a chilling, profound silence. Grand Duke Ernst Ludwig had successfully navigated the most dangerous crisis of his reign. He had stared down the barrel of total public ruin, criminal exposure, and dynastic collapse, and he had survived. The hostile witness to his darkest, most degrading secrets had been legally expelled from his territory. To the outside world, he presented the dignified, stoic face of a monarch who had weathered a tragic, unavoidable marital failure with absolute grace. Within the heavily guarded walls of his private life, however, he simply resumed the architecture of his hidden deviance, entirely convinced that his sovereign power had permanently immunized him from consequences. He believed he had won. He retained his throne, his public reputation, and, most crucially, absolute control over his beloved daughter, Princess Elizabeth. In a life fractured by profound deceit and the crushing weight of royal expectation, the young girl was not merely a dynastic asset. She was his psychological anchor. In her presence, the defensive armor of the sovereign dissolved. Elizabeth became his redemption, the living proof that despite his hidden transgressions, he was capable of a profound, unselfish devotion. Hundreds of miles away, living in a state of forced exile on the French Riviera, Princess Victoria Melita was enduring a vastly different reality. The divorce had set her free from the physical prison of Darmstadt, but the custody arrangement had effectively ripped her heart out. She was a mother stripped of her child by the very institution that had orchestrated her abuse. Ducky spent her days in a state of suspended agony, surviving on the scraps of supervised visits that the Hessian court grudgingly allowed her. She watched from a distance as Ernst paraded their daughter before the press, using the child's innocent, smiling face to sanitize his public image. The sheer hypocrisy of the situation, that the man who had dragged the filth of the stables to their bedchamber was now deemed the morally superior parent by the European courts, hardened her into a woman of cold, absolute cynicism. She had learned the hardest lesson of the aristocratic world. Morality was a weapon used exclusively against women, while men of power were granted total devastating impunity. But the tragic, inescapable reality of the royal bloodline is that immunity is an illusion. Power can manipulate courts, silence servants, and intimidate the press, but it cannot negotiate with biology. The ultimate devastation that was about to strike the House of Hesse would not come from a scandalous newspaper article or a political revolution. It would come in the microscopic, invisible form of a deadly pathogen, and it would target the absolute center of Ernst Ludwig's universe. In November 1903, Ernst traveled to the sprawling imperial hunting lodge at Skierniewice in Poland, which was then part of the Russian Empire. It was a massive, highly exclusive gathering of the Romanov dynasty, hosted by Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra, Ernst's own sister. Princess Elizabeth, bright, vibrant, and entirely adored by the extended royal family, accompanied her father. The atmosphere was one of immense, suffocating opulence. The lodge was filled with grand dukes, military generals, and the most powerful figures of the Russian autocracy engaging in days of hunting, lavish banquets, and political maneuvering. It was during this trip, surrounded by the absolute pinnacle of global power, that the 8-year-old princess suddenly fell ill. What began as a complaint of a sore throat and a fever rapidly escalated into a terrifying, highly aggressive medical crisis. The court physicians were immediately summoned. They initially diagnosed it as a severe case of influenza, attempting to treat the symptoms with the rudimentary, ineffective medical practices of the era. But as the hours passed, Elizabeth's condition deteriorated with alarming speed. Her temperature spiked violently. She slipped in and out of consciousness, her small body convulsing in agony. Panic, genuine and unfiltered, swept through the imperial lodge. The Tsar's personal physicians, the most elite medical minds in the Russian Empire, were brought to her bedside. They realized with a cold, terrifying certainty that this was not influenza. It was a virulent, incredibly aggressive strain of typhoid fever. There is a historical debate that still lingers in the shadows of this event, a persistent, chilling rumor that the child had not contracted typhoid naturally, but had inadvertently consumed a plate of poisoned food intended for the Tsar, provided by early Russian revolutionaries. While the official medical records firmly point to typhoid, the sheer, sudden violence of her illness in a heavily guarded, hyper-sterile imperial environment fueled the darkest suspicions of the era. Whatever the exact biological cause, the reality in that bedroom was absolute, unstoppable devastation. The tragedy devastated Ernst Ludwig. The sovereign who had meticulously controlled his illicit court was reduced to a broken father, forced to watch history violently repeat itself as the disease claimed his only child. On November 16, 1903, despite the frantic, desperate efforts of the doctors, Princess Elizabeth's heart gave out. She died in the early hours of the morning, reportedly holding her father's hand. The death of the child sent shock waves through the royal courts of Europe, but for Ernst it was a psychological annihilation. He did not simply mourn, he collapsed. The courtiers who witnessed his grief described a man who had been completely hollowed out. The absolute confidence, the arrogant belief that he could control his destiny and manipulate the consequences of his actions, died in that room in Poland. He accompanied the small silver casket on the agonizingly long train journey back to Darmstadt. He sat in the darkened carriage, staring at the polished metal. Entire, Ely alone with the crushing, inescapable guilt of a survivor. In the dark, quiet corners of his mind, he could not help but view the tragedy through the lens of divine retribution. He had abused his power. He had violated the sacred laws of his era. He had destroyed his wife, and in return, the universe had taken the only thing he genuinely loved. The funeral in Darmstadt was a massive, highly orchestrated display of state mourning, but its most devastating moment was entirely private. Princess Victoria Melita, dressed in heavy, suffocating black crepe, arrived in the Hessian capital to bury the daughter she'd been forced to leave behind. She stood across the open grave from the man she absolutely despised. They did not speak. They did not offer each other a single gesture of comfort. The hatred between them was too deep, too thoroughly calcified by years of abuse and betrayal. Ducky looked at the devastated, weeping figure of Ernst Ludwig and felt no sympathy. She believed with the cold, hard logic of a wronged mother that his actions had poisoned their family, and this was the ultimate horrific price. When the dirt was thrown onto the silver casket, the final fragile thread connecting them was permanently severed. Ducky turned her back on Darmstadt and walked away forever. The aftermath of Elizabeth's death triggered a profound divergence in the paths of the Grand Duke and his former Duchess. Stripped of the one reason she had ever tolerated the Hessian court, Ducky threw off the final restraints of royal expectation. She was done playing the role of the compliant, tragic victim. In a move of staggering defiance that shocked the European establishment, she engaged in an open, highly scandalous romance with her first cousin, Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich of Russia. The Russian Orthodox Church strictly forbade marriages between first cousins, and Tsar Nicholas II explicitly ordered Kirill to end the relationship. But Ducky, forged in the fires of Ernst's bet, rails and hardened by the loss of her child, refused to be controlled by another monarch. In 1905, she and Kirill defied the Tsar, the Church, and the entire royal system by marrying in a quiet ceremony in Bavaria. The retribution from the Russian court was instant and brutal. Nicholas II stripped Kirill of his imperial titles, his military commissions, and his massive royal allowance. The couple was formally banished from the Russian Empire. Yet for the first time in her entire adult life, Ducky did not care. She chose poverty, exile, and public disgrace over the suffocating, hypocritical safety of the royal machine. She had found a man who actually desired her, a man willing to sacrifice his own imperial standing to be with her. It was a stark, glaring contrast to the cowardice of her first husband, who had hidden behind the skirts of Queen Victoria to protect his illicit underground life. Back in Darmstadt, Ernst Ludwig was forced to confront the cold, mechanical reality of his position. He was a grieving, broken man, but he was still a sovereign ruler, and his dynasty was now completely devoid of an heir. The political pressure from his ministers and the German emperor was immense. He could not mourn indefinitely. The machinery of the state demanded that he secure the bloodline, which meant he had to endure the one thing he dreaded most. He had to marry again. Following the scandalous divorce and the tragic loss of his daughter, Ernst secured his bloodline through a pragmatic, emotionally detached second marriage to Princess Eleanor. This compliant union provided the ultimate cover, allowing him to successfully rewrite his public narrative as a dignified patriarch. Although the 1918 German Revolution eventually stripped him of his throne, the long-buried secrets of his illicit past remained hidden from the revolutionary tribunals. Ernst retreated to a comfortable exile, dying peacefully in 1937 without ever facing public accountability. Yet, in a dark twist of dynastic fate, mere weeks after his death, a catastrophic plane crash in Belgium entirely wiped out his immediate inheriting bloodline. The future of the House of Hesse was reduced to ashes, leaving his nephew, a young Prince Philip, to walk behind the flag-draped coffins. The tragedy abruptly ended Ernst's immediate legacy, leaving behind a chilling testament to the brutal nature of dynastic survival. When we strip away the glittering medals, the royal titles, and the grand, tragic, sweeping arcs of the Mountbatten and Windsor histories, we are left with a profoundly unsettling moral reality. The story of Grand Duke Ernst Ludwig is not a romantic tragedy of an era gone by. It is a clinical, terrifying study in the architecture of institutional abuse. It forces us to confront the terrifying ease with which the highest echelons of power can distort reality, crush the innocent, and rewrite history to protect their own. The casualties of this royal preservation included both the nameless stable boy, thrust into an illicit world of sovereign indulgence, only to be permanently erased when he became inconvenient, and Princess Victoria Melita, a woman told by the most powerful monarch on earth that her suffering was a necessary sacrifice for an empire's reputation. Queen Victoria's ruthless decision to bury the scandal set a devastating precedent that echoed through the entire 20th century. It established a playbook of royal survival that prioritized the flawless image of the institution over the fundamental truth, a playbook that would be utilized time and time again to silence the inconvenient, the traumatized, and the broken individuals caught in the orbit of the throne. Grand Duke Ernst Ludwig survived his own degeneracy not because he was innocent, but because the system that empowered him was fundamentally, entirely corrupt. Ultimately, the legacy of the Hessian court is a haunting reminder that absolute power does not elevate the human spirit. It simply provides as a larger, more opulent stage for our deepest flaws. The true cost of a royal bloodline is rarely paid by the monarchs who wear the crowns. It is paid in the darkness by the servants who are silenced, the spouses who are sacrificed, and the undeniable truths that are buried deep beneath the cold, heavy stones of the palace floor. The glittering facade of the monarchy may command our attention, but it is the shadows it casts, the deliberate, brutal suppression of human reality that truly define its history.